It's The Log. I'm Charles Purcell. On this second Monday in October, Indigenous Peoples Day. It's a good day to learn what you can. If you yourself are a Native American, congratulations to you and take pride in your heritage. And I'm sure you're always learning more about your own history and heritage. I bet that's kind of a nice thing to do. We should all do that. That's something that I encourage, always have, regardless of where your people come from. It can only be a good thing to know more about them. I don't know too much, actually, about my ancestors and the culture that faded away when they came to America. A bunch of farmers, poor folks mostly, from Scotland on my dad's side and from Sweden on my mom's side. I went through a phase there where I was really kind of interested in learning more about the more ancient folks from those regions, the Celts and the pagan religions, and I kind of got into that for a while. After I'd long given up my childhood of Catholicism, we talked about that the other day, went through several years of just kind of straight atheism, and then I thought, let me explore the Wiccans and the pagans. Those are my people. Those are my ancestors, Northern European tree huggers. So I looked into that for a little bit. It's great. My own knowledge of Native American history and culture is limited to, it's limited. Let's just put it that way. I'm not going to pretend today to know anything beyond the following. Let's see here. Well, my oldest sister, I come from a large family, lots of kids. I lost count. 7, 8, 9, 10 kids. I forget. But the oldest two girls, Mary and Debbie, we share the same father but a different mother. My father's first wife was a Native American, and she died when the two girls were still very young. And then my dad married my mom and had a whole bunch more kids. But my oldest sister, Mary, took a lot of interest in looking back to her roots and learning about her mother, who died when Mary was just a very small girl, I think just 3 or 4 years old. So she went through quite a process and did find records of her mom who, like thousands and thousands of young Native American children, were sent to Catholic boarding schools. So she found some history about her mother and then as a result then became a little bit involved in the local community here in Milwaukee. And my sister Mary took me to a couple of powwows, events, and I'd highly recommend that. That's kind of a wonderful thing. Of course, as a person outside the tribe, you have to be sort of cognizant of how and where you belong. You don't necessarily, we don't want to appropriate, assume. It's recognized even between tribes. If you're not a member of that particular tribe, well, you stay out of certain dances and rituals. You're welcome to be there, but you don't just dive in. So be aware of that. But yeah, going to Native American events, I encourage that. Go to events that are open to the public. My limited knowledge and experience also includes a class I took. My undergrad was in philosophy. And I remember at the time looking at the requirements for my philosophy degree at San Francisco State University and being kind of disappointed there wasn't any interdisciplinary aspect to the major at all. I would have assumed, or I did assume going in, that among my requirements would be things like, you have to take at least a couple of Black studies or Native American or women's studies or Hispanic or something. But to my surprise, it wasn't required. So I just took it upon myself to take those classes. I took feminist studies and 1 or 2 African American studies courses, and I took American Indian philosophy and religion. And it was really wonderful. Dr. Bernard Honer, great old guy, Native American scholar, member of Let's see. I'm looking at his bio right now. Respected Lakota elder. He was a consultant for Hollywood movies and TV shows regarding American Indian culture and history. And he was a great guy. He led a drum circle that he took all of his students to. And I studied with him for a semester, Native American religion and philosophy. Just kind of got the basics. And of course, there are how many? 500 plus different tribes. So there's no uniformity, but there are lots of overlap and lots of common themes, the four directions and the idea that, the whole 7-generation thing looking ahead. A little bit about the politics of Native Americans. Yeah, learned a lot. It was a wonderful experience. Of course, another thing you can do on any holiday that celebrates culture is take some time to find some good reading. Of course, I read for the assigned reading that Dr. Honer assigned for us, which of course included Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, An Indian History of the American West by D. Brown, 1970. When you think of Native American writing, that's right at the top of the list. And then more recently, when did this just came out? 2015, I believe. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. I highly recommend this. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. It doesn't go too far back. I mean, it concentrates on the history that begins with the European invasion. So I'd like myself to find, maybe you can recommend something to read that goes much further back than that. I'd love to read pre-Europeans on this continent history. That I haven't read too much. But I highly recommend Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Dunbar Ortiz. Very, very good. Much acclaimed book, and I thought it was fantastic. Of course, kind of picks up where Howard Zinn left off, hence the title, Indigenous Peoples. In Zinn's classic, A People's History of the United States, he begins in 1492. So there again, a chapter or two on Native Americans and their relationship with the invaders, but doesn't go earlier than that. Let's give you some recommendations here. 12 books by Indigenous writers to read this Indigenous Peoples Day. All right, so you know what? I'll share this on the Facebook page today. I hope you have already liked the Charles Purcell Facebook page. If you haven't, do it today. I always share nice things with you. So look for me on Facebook. 12 books by Indigenous writers to read this Indigenous Peoples Day. I like the subtitle of this article, A Reading List to Help You Decolonize Your Bookshelf. That's good. That's good. Indigenous Peoples Day is today a reclamation of what is still too often known as Columbus Day. Instead of celebrating indigenous genocide and white settler colonialism, it behooves U.S. citizens, especially white ones, to make a point to read indigenous authors today and every day. Here's a list of books that came out this year by indigenous writers you can read in order to help decolonize your bookshelf. And I like that very much. I like the fact that these are all brand new books, and it's very true. As a white guy myself who grew up playing cowboys and Indians and all of that, just like a lot of people. And then even if you do, you come of age and you go to college, you try to have the right attitudes about things. There's a little danger of, like I was saying earlier, there's a danger of appropriating. There's a danger of becoming, playing the white savior card. There are a lot of little pitfalls you can fall into. And as I open the show, it's a shame how we do tend to concentrate still on Columbus, and we only think of indigenous people as victims and in relation to the European invasion. And in that light, then we only, a lot of white folks, when they think of indigenous people, they think historically and not currently. So a lot of pitfalls that one can fall into. So, just looking down the list. An American Sunrise, poems by Joy Harjo, Poet Laureate of the United States. Okay. Another book here, Hope Matters, a collaboration between a few writers. Here's a book of humor, essays by Tiffany Midge, member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and the poet laureate of Moscow, Idaho. And the title of the book is Bury My Heart at Chuck E. Cheese's by Tiffany Midge. So a little bit of everything here on this list. Oh, this requires a recommendation as well. Talked about an Indigenous Peoples history of the United States. There's a version, an adaptation of that book for young people. An Indigenous Peoples history of the United States for young people. And that one, I've heard great things about this. Adapted by Debbie Reese and Jean Mendoza. Yeah, there's a young people's version of that. Read great things about that. So there. That's everything I know. Like I said, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert today, but I do want to be a little bit of a cheerleader and encourage everyone to celebrate and honor Indigenous peoples of North America, because here we sit, and the history is sad and bloody, and talk about the least we can do. The least we can do is understand the people who lived here for thousands of years, and to embrace our friends and neighbors who are descendants. I mean, talk about the least we could do. I guess the most recent headlines we've seen, it was a few weeks ago, everybody was talking about this Supreme Court ruling. Looking at the NPR article at the time. This goes back to July, early July. Supreme Court rules that about half of Oklahoma is Native American land. Do you remember seeing this headline? It was quite a thing. The Supreme Court ruled Thursday, so that would have been July 8th or 9th, that about half of the land in Oklahoma is within a Native American reservation, a decision that will have major consequences for both past and future criminal and civil cases. The court's decision hinged on the question of whether the Creek Reservation continued to exist after Oklahoma became a state. Today we are asked whether the land these treaties promised remains an Indian reservation for purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word. That's the quote from Justice Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the majority opinion. So there was lots of excitement from the headlines. Everybody kind of got the impression, the mistaken impression, that it was an issue of land ownership, that the land itself went back to the tribes. Well, that wasn't the case. It was never the case, but the headlines weren't very clear. And that's the impression that a lot of people got. And journalists had to kind of walk that back a little bit. No. The land itself wasn't just given over lock, stock, and barrel, which would have been great. I mean, I've been advocating that for years. I think we'd be a lot better off if we just gave the whole damn place back and let them have ownership and make the laws and the rules, just like they did before we got here. We meaning the European invaders. And that's not a joke at all. I mean it quite sincerely. So a lot of people got pretty excited. Oh, look at that. Half of Oklahoma. They'd show us the map. It's half the damn state. But of course, it really had to do mostly with the law. And so it's just kind of a jurisdiction thing. And it was not that it wasn't a big deal. It still was a big deal. Looking back through this today, I found another article I missed at the time. Pretty good interview on the website Living on Earth, LOE.org. I'll share this one too. It goes back to, September 25th. A recent Supreme Court ruling recognized Native American sovereignty over millions of acres of tribal lands in Oklahoma. Rebecca Nagel is a member of Cherokee Nation and host of the podcast This Land. Okay, I'm going to have to subscribe. Which tracks the pair of cases that led to the Supreme Court ruling. She joins Living on Earth's Jenny Doring to talk about what this ruling means after decades of ignored rights of Native American tribal members living in Oklahoma and the implications for Indian country as a whole. Yeah, let's share this one too. I haven't listened to this myself. Got the transcript here and the recording, so great. Quoting now Nagel from the interview. The simplest way to say what happened is that prior to this ruling, Oklahoma was exerting criminal jurisdiction over us, and Oklahoma no longer has that criminal jurisdiction. I mean, it never actually had it in the first place. It was exercising illegally, and now the Supreme Court has basically told them that they have to stop. And so now crimes committed against Native Americans or by Native Americans will have to be prosecuted either by the tribe or by the federal government. Okay. So those original boundaries, established in 1866, are reinstated, are recognized, again, for the purposes primarily of enforcing law. Now, again, a lot of us had the impression, we're kind of excited this meant actual transfer of land. And Doring asks Nagel about that. Doring asks, so I understand that this decision from the Supreme Court does not mean that land that is currently held by non-tribal, non-native owners in the boundaries of the Muskogee Reservation, it doesn't mean that it's going to be taken away from them and transferred to the tribes. So I'm wondering what that means for regulations on the land. And now that's a really good question. So what does it mean for land regulation? So she's clarifying that it's not a transfer of ownership, but asking about regulation of the land. Here's how Nagel answers that. Well, yeah, so the question of regulations, and I think specifically environmental regulations, looms large. Oklahoma has pretty much embraced the oil and gas industry. And the bad news is that there are some congressional bills and there's some Supreme Court decisions that actually pretty strongly restrict our tribe's ability. So there's this court case from the early 80s called Montana that basically says that tribes on fee land can only exercise civil jurisdiction. All right, so yeah, that leaves regulatory power over the land regarding things like big ag, like she's talking about. Certainly oil and gas industry, which is huge, which rules Oklahoma. So left a lot of that in question. So there you go. There's another recommendation. I'm not going to go through the rest of it, but highly recommend you check that out. I'll share it on the Facebook page. Living on Earth, A Win for Native American Sovereignty, interview with Rebecca Nagel, host of the podcast This Land. Yeah, I'm going to check that out for sure. And then, of course, as you may or may not have heard, now the most recent headline on this is just from a couple of days ago, where the Environmental Protection Agency, at least that's what they call it, so now the EPA has granted Oklahoma control over these tribal lands that we've been talking about. The EPA has stepped in to say, no, this recent ruling by the Supreme Court does not take away power of the state of Oklahoma to regulate tribal lands. And of course, what else would you expect from this EPA? Let's read here from the Young Turks, October 5th, so just a week ago. The Environmental Protection Agency has granted the state of Oklahoma regulatory control over environmental issues on nearly all tribal lands there. This strips from 38 tribes in Oklahoma their sovereignty over environmental issues. It also establishes a legal and administrative pathway to potential environmental abuses on tribal land, including dumping hazardous chemicals like carcinogenic PCBs and petroleum spills with no legal recourse by the tribes, according to a former high-level official of the EPA. This also includes hazardous chemicals that are byproducts of petroleum procurement and refining. In 2019, Oklahoma had the fourth largest petroleum industry in the United States. So this is very disappointing and to be expected from this EPA, from this administration. And so here's how they did it. Here's how they finagled this. This guy's name has come up a few times here on the log. James Inhofe is one of the worst people in American government, senator from Oklahoma. He's the guy who infamously held up the snowball on the floor of the Senate to prove there was no such thing as global warming. NewRepublic.com, just from last week. A nice little explanation on how they made this happen. In 2005, Congress passed a bill aimed at authorizing federal funds for the upkeep and creation of federally aided roads and highways. So it was this big, long, boring bill, which was kind of basically just a list of projects and the kind of thing that nobody pays any attention to. But as the New Republic points out here in this article, Inhofe took the opportunity to slide something in to this bill. Again, very sort of dry legalese that nobody quite gets. But here's how they describe it. In layman's terms, if the state of Oklahoma asks, the Environmental Protection Agency wields the authority to give the state government regulatory control over all environmental issues that take place on tribal lands in Oklahoma. So James Inhofe, 15 years ago, created this provision that is now being triggered. You know, when a guy holds up a snowball as proof that climate change is a hoax, you automatically think this guy's stupid, right? Now, these guys aren't stupid. That's the problem. Inhofe ain't stupid. So now they're using this provision to make it very clear after the recent Supreme Court decision that no, you might have some criminal jurisdiction. If some pickpocket gets arrested, go ahead. You can deal with that. But the really big important stuff, the oil and gas industry, how we want to regulate land use, nope, that's us. Inhofe planted the seed, made it possible, and today's EPA, here's another guy we've spoken about recently, Andrew Wheeler, head of the EPA, lobbyist for Murray Energy, one of the biggest, most evil energy companies you can find, worked for James Inhofe as an aide. This is his background. A climate denier, Andrew Wheeler, and now he's head of the EPA in this bizarro world we live in. And he's reaching in to say, yep, I control this now. So not good news. Not good news on this Indigenous Peoples Day. Well, a lot more to it, a lot more detail that I'm not qualified to talk about. I'm being very humble today. I'm being very humble. I really can't get in too much detail about these stories because I'm just not the guy. But I do encourage you to find it. I'll share this little cluster of articles on the Facebook page for you. But it really is true. What I was saying earlier, I'm really not kidding. If there was a way to get as much land as possible back to Native American tribes, I just think the world in this country would be a better place. I remember when the Green New Deal first hit the headlines, and we were all reading about that. One of the driving philosophies of the Green New Deal was to embrace Indigenous peoples' knowledge and methodology for living on the land. This is not romanticizing anything. I'm not playing the young philosophy major romanticized Native Americans can do no wrong. No, it's just a fact that Indigenous peoples lived here for thousands and thousands of years, and they did learn quite well how to live on and with the land. Getting back to the whole philosophy and religion class that I took with Dr. Honer. Sure, there were lots of variations among the 500 different tribes, but generally speaking, the values that were shared among the tribes was this understanding of the relationship between the people and the land, one that the Europeans lost over time. This is why I took such joy in discovering my ancient ancestors, the Wiccans, the pagans, again, land-based religions, honoring, worshiping the land. And then it just becomes a joke after a while. Oh, worship trees. Trees have spirits. If you're like me, if you're a white guy living in America, and at some point your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents came through Ellis Island, you've got that same heritage in your blood. You have a lot more in common with Native Americans than you think. Because that's the ethos that was lost somewhere along the line with Europeans. But it's not too late. It's not too late to resurrect that same attitude on the continent which we all now share. So yeah, I was really heartened by the acknowledgement of that in the Green New Deal. Soil conservation, crop rotation, concepts that are well understood still today, practiced for thousands and thousands of years, but woefully underappreciated, practiced only by a minuscule fraction of small farmers, but ideas that need to be incorporated across the land. We've heard recently with the fires in California, the terrible, terrible fires, pre-invasion time, the people of this continent seem to have a pretty good management strategy from what I'm finding out, from what I'm reading. They understood how natural fires replenished the forests and the soil, burned away all the deadwood that builds up as kindling. But post-European invasion, everything changes, and now decade after decade after decade, we've got suppression of natural fires and just a completely inappropriate philosophy for managing land foreign to them. Here's another really great example that I just read about recently, reading from The Guardian right now. Bringing beaches back to life, the First Nations restoring ancient clam gardens. For millennia, pre-colonization, clam gardens epitomized sustainable food security for Pacific Northwestern coastal nations, from northern Washington to southeastern Alaska. Modern studies have found that clam gardens have historically been up to 300% more productive than unmodified beaches, that their clams grew larger and faster than average, and that the clams did not exhibit any signs of resource stress from over-harvesting. To create the beaches, Indigenous people built rock walls parallel to a beach's low tide line, which would trap sediment and flatten the slope of the shore. Recent carbon dating has revealed that the oldest clam garden known to science was built about 3,500 years ago. This runs counter to misconceptions that prevailed during colonial settlement of Canada, that First Nations peoples were foragers without established agricultural practices. Such ideas were used as justification for damaging policies that displaced communities from their ancestral land and criminalized traditional practices. So this clamming thing is just one example of an environmental ethos that we just desperately need right now. When the Europeans invaded, they were invading a complex, multicultural, diverse continent of people with dynamic lives, dynamic ideas, a shared value of reverence for the land and our place on it, and sophisticated in architecture, in agriculture, in the preservation of water, rivers, lakes, seashore. Yeah, when I get on my most extreme rants about give it all back, I'm really not kidding. Not in the slightest. In every way possible, we just need to hand the keys back to the original owner. I believe it. So anyway, that's what I'm thinking about today on Indigenous Peoples Day. And we should talk about it more often, but we should certainly talk about it and think about it today. So, happy Indigenous Peoples Day, everybody. Let's make every day Indigenous Peoples Day. All right, I love you guys. There it is. That's the log. I'm Charles Purcell. Follow, like, and talk to me on Facebook and Twitter. Go to the website for all the shows. That's charlespurcell.com. Find the log along with the whole family of titles at Apple Podcasts or wherever you find yours. Search Charles Purcell Presents. Okay, there you go. See ya.